I rolled down my window, my face neutral, as the middle-aged woman in a reflective vest and aviator sunglasses stepped up to my car. She held a clipboard in one hand, a fake badge dangling from her neck, and an air of overconfidence that reeked of authority issues. The neon-orange traffic cones she had arranged in a sloppy semicircle made it clear she had no actual clue how real traffic stops worked. Still, she tapped my hood with her pen like she was dealing with a known felon. "License, registration, and neighborhood pass," she said sharply, not even bothering with a greeting. I stared at her for a beat. "Excuse me. You were speeding in a residential zone," she continued, flipping through her clipboard as if there was something official on it. "And failure to present an HOA pass is an automatic fine of $200. Payable now or added to your property dues." I glanced around, making sure I was seeing this correctly. It was past 8 at night, and the only other officials present were a couple of elderly men in lawn chairs sipping what I could only assume was boxed wine. One of them gave me a slow thumbs up, while the other fumbled with a walkie-talkie, probably reporting my offense to absolutely no one. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting an eerie glow over the bizarre spectacle. Karen Wilkins, the self-appointed dictator of our homeowners association. The woman who had personally left 3 notes on my door about my non-compliant mailbox color within the first week of my moving in. The same woman who had tried to enforce a curfew on Halloween to maintain order. I had already heard plenty of stories about her power trips, but this was a new level. I smiled, leaning an arm on my door. "Karen, do you realize you just tried to fine an off-duty cop at your fake police checkpoint?" For the first time her expression faltered. Her eyes flickered to my chest where my actual police badge was clipped to my belt. Then she did what all Karens do when backed into a corner. She doubled down. "That's irrelevant," she snapped. "HOA regulations apply to everyone, including law enforcement. The speed limit in the neighborhood is 15 miles per hour. You were going at least 20. I pinched the bridge of my nose, exhaling slowly. "You have no radar gun, no authority to issue citations, and no legal right to detain anyone. You know that, right?" She let out a dry laugh like I was the one being ridiculous. "I work closely with the local police department. They support our efforts to keep this community safe." That was an outright lie, but I decided to let her dig herself into a deeper hole. "Oh yeah? Who's your contact?" She blinked rapidly, then squared her shoulders. "That's confidential information." I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. This was either the dumbest or the boldest attempt at impersonating an officer I had ever seen. I could already feel my partner's reaction when I told him about this. The memes that would come from this were going to be legendary. Karen adjusted her sunglasses despite it being completely unnecessary. "You have 2 options. You can pay your fine now, or I can call law enforcement to handle this properly." That did it. I couldn't hold back my grin any longer. "Karen, please do. I would love to have a chat with law enforcement." She narrowed her eyes, then spun on her heel and marched toward the elderly man with the walkie-talkie. I could hear her whispering urgently something about needing backup. I pulled out my phone, already dialing my precinct. The second the dispatcher answered, I kept it brief. "Hey, it's Carter. Can you send a unit over to my address? Got a situation with an HOA member impersonating an officer." The dispatcher snorted. "Oh, this is gonna be good." By the time the real police arrived, Karen had managed to gather a small audience of neighbors, all watching with varying expressions of amusement and concern. One woman was recording the whole thing, clearly anticipating a viral moment. The patrol car pulled up and 2 officers stepped out. One of them, Officer Daniels, took one look at me leaning against my car and sighed. "Jake, what did you do?" I smirked. "I drove home. Apparently that's illegal now." Karen stepped forward, confidence restored now that she had a proper audience. "Officers, I'm so glad you're here. This man was speeding through our neighborhood and refusing to comply with our safety measures." Daniels arched an eyebrow at me. "Speeding? At least 20 miles per hour, she said firmly. Daniels looked at me, then back at Karen. "Ma'am, that's not speeding." "It is according to HOA regulations," she shot back. "That's not how laws work," he said, rubbing his temples. Karen huffed in frustration. "He also refused to pay his fine." I held up my hands. "Oh, I totally would have, but I left my Monopoly money at home." There was a snort from somewhere in the crowd. Karen's face turned a dangerous shade of red. This is no joke. He's breaking the rules. Daniels, clearly trying to keep a straight face, pulled out his notepad. All right, ma'am, let's go through this step by step. You set up a traffic stop. Yes, to maintain community standards. You demanded payment on site for an alleged traffic violation? As per HOA policy, she confirmed. Daniels nodded, flipping his notebook shut. Hey, that's extortion. Karen's mouth fell open. What? No, it's an enforcement fee. Daniels didn't budge. Ma'am, you're not law enforcement. You have no authority to fine anyone, detain anyone, or set up a checkpoint. What you're doing is illegal. For the first time, Karen looked genuinely rattled. But I was just trying to protect our neighborhood. You impersonated an officer, Daniels continued. You issued a fake citation. And you attempted to collect money under false pretenses. That's at least 3 separate crimes. Karen's face flickered between denial and panic. This is ridiculous. I'll be contacting the mayor about this. Daniels sighed, pulling out his radio. Dispatch, I need a supervisor down here. Karen's expression finally crumbled. She turned to the crowd, hoping for support. Instead, she found her neighbors shaking their heads, some outright laughing. The woman recording zoomed in. This is gold, she whispered. I folded my arms, watching as the reality of the situation hit Karen in real time. She had finally overplayed her hand. And the best part? This was only the beginning. Karen sat on the curb, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her once imposing authority reduced to the posture of a sulking child. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cars cast an ironic glow over the ridiculous homemade checkpoint she had orchestrated. The cones, the clipboard, even the fake badge around her neck. All of it screamed desperation now rather than power. A few neighbors lingered at a distance, some pretending to walk their dogs just to eavesdrop. Others didn't bother hiding their interest, phones held high as they recorded what was quickly becoming a legendary moment in HOA history. Officer Daniels sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose as he crouched next to her. Karen, I need to be very clear here. What you did tonight was not just an overstep. It was illegal. Extortion, impersonation, unlawful detainment. This could get real ugly for you. Karen scoffed, tilting her chin upward. I was only doing what needed to be done. If the police won't enforce order in this community, someone has to. Daniels exhaled slowly, glancing at me, his expression the picture of exhausted patience. I could tell he was debating whether it was even worth explaining logic to her. Finally, he gestured for me to step away with him. I swear, man, this HOA stuff is like a whole separate legal system, he muttered under his breath. People get drunk on power over the dumbest things. I nodded, keeping my voice low. I've been hearing stories about her pulling stunts like this for months. Fake fines, threatening to tow cars, even shutting down a neighborhood lemonade stand last summer because it didn't have proper vendor approval. Daniels let out a low whistle. Sounds like a real peach. He glanced back at Karen, who was now dramatically sighing as if she were the victim here. Look, legally I could take her in tonight. But something tells me she'd just find a way to weasel out of it. And I don't have time for a 2-hour interrogation where she demands to speak to the governor. I considered this, an idea forming in the back of my mind. What if we give her just enough rope to hang herself? Daniels raised an eyebrow. Go on. I turned slightly, making sure Karen wasn't listening, though I doubted she could hear anything over the sound of her own self-righteous muttering. I've got a hunch she's been running these fines for months. Probably pocketing the money too. But I need proof. If we let her think she got away with this, she'll try something again. Something worse. Daniels smirked. You want to bait her? I shrugged. She's got an ego the size of Texas. If we act like she just got a slap on the wrist, she'll double down. He thought for a moment, then nodded. All right. We'll release her with a warning. But if she pulls this again, I want a call immediately. I turned back to Karen, who immediately straightened as if she had somehow won. Before I could speak, she cut me off. I expect this misunderstanding to be properly documented in my favor. My lawyer will be in touch. I fought the urge to laugh. Of course, Karen. Wouldn't want anything to seem unfair. She smirked, dusting herself off as she stood. Good. Then I'll be resuming my duties first thing tomorrow. Daniels looked like he wanted to slam his head against the nearest mailbox. Instead, he simply motioned for his officers to pack up. Karen strutted off, acting as if she had just defeated the government in court. The moment she was out of sight, I pulled out my phone and texted a couple of my neighbors. I needed to know just how deep this went. Within minutes, responses flooded in. Stories of people being fined for leaving their trash cans out a minute too long, of receiving warnings for unauthorized gatherings, when they had backyard BBQs, of Karen attempting to have a teenager's car towed for having too many bumper stickers. Then came the real bombshell. A neighbor, an older man named Frank, sent me a photo of a handwritten ledger he had managed to snap when Karen wasn't looking. Pages upon pages of names, dollar amounts, and a disturbing note at the bottom that read, "Excess funds from fines, to be redirected for HOA officer bonuses." I called Frank immediately. "You got a copy of that ledger?" "Sure do," he said. "She's been running this racket for years. Anyone who questions her gets a lovely little, anonymous, complaint to the city about their yard or their property. And if you really push back, she starts talking about legal action, until people just pay up to make her go away." I grinned. "Frank, you just made my night." The next morning I went for a jog around the neighborhood just to see what Karen was up to. As expected, she was back at it, clipboard in hand, stopping an unsuspecting mother walking her toddler in a stroller. "I don't see a permit for this stroller on file," Karen was saying. The woman looked utterly baffled. "A permit? For a stroller?" Karen nodded as if this was the most reasonable thing in the world. "We have very clear regulations about sidewalk obstructions." I cleared my throat, stopping just beside them. "Morning, Karen. Working hard." She barely looked at me. "Just keeping the streets safe." The mother took the opportunity to hurry away. I watched as Karen scribbled something on her clipboard. Probably a note about fining her later. "Listen, Karen," I said casually. "I was wondering, where do all these fines go anyway? HOA improvements? Charity?" Her expression darkened. "That's confidential." "Oh, I bet it is." I smirked. "Because it looks an awful lot like fraud." She paled. "Excuse me." I pulled out my phone, showing her the picture Frank had sent. "Ledger looks pretty official to me." For the first time, Karen had no response. She stared at the screen, her jaw clenched, her hands gripping her clipboard like it was a lifeline. "I'd start thinking about your next move carefully," I said. "Because that little operation of yours, it's about to get real public real fast." She tried to snatch my phone, but I pulled it away, shaking my head. "Not smart, Karen. Real cops tend to frown on assault." Her nostrils flared, but she said nothing. I took a step back. "You like rules, right? Well, I think it's about time someone enforces them. Properly." Then I walked away, leaving her standing there, clipboard shaking in her hands. She had just realized she wasn't the one in control anymore. Karen had always believed she was untouchable. That was the problem with people like her. They built their power on nothing but fear and intimidation, and as soon as someone pulled back the curtain, their empire crumbled faster than they could scramble to pick up the pieces. I had spent the last few days gathering every shred of evidence I could, and what I had found was enough to bury her. It wasn't just the fake fines or the fabricated HOA laws. It was fraud, embezzlement, and straight-up extortion. And the best part? She didn't even see it coming. The neighborhood meeting was held in the community center, a small building that Karen had spent years treating like her personal courtroom. I arrived early, wanting to see just how many people had caught wind of what was coming. To my satisfaction, the room was packed. Homeowners filled every chair, some standing against the back walls, whispering in hushed voices. I caught snippets of conversation, complaints about Karen's ridiculous fines, her harassment, her threats. It was clear that people were ready for change. They just needed someone to strike the first blow. When Karen entered, she carried herself with the same self-importance as always, chin lifted, eyes scanning the room as if she were the queen of some doomed kingdom. She clutched her ever-present clipboard, though I suspected this time it was more for comfort than authority. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't need to. She was used to ruling with silence, expecting obedience. Tonight she would find out what happened when people stopped playing along. She took her seat at the front, flanked by a few other HOA board members. Most of them looked uncomfortable, likely aware of what was coming. One of them, a nervous-looking man named George, kept adjusting his tie, his knee bouncing under the table. Karen tapped her pen against the clipboard, then cleared her throat, silencing the murmurs in the room. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice dripping with forced authority. Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone to keep the discussion civil. This is a community meeting, not a free-for-all. Someone snorted in the crowd. Karen's eyes flicked to the source, but whoever it was didn't care enough to hide their amusement. That was already a bad sign for her. I waited until she started rattling off the usual nonsense about neighborhood standards before I spoke. Actually, Karen, before we talk about community guidelines, there's something else we need to discuss. She stiffened at my interruption. Excuse me. I stood up, holding up my phone. I've been doing some digging. And it turns out the HOA has been collecting a lot of money in fines that aren't exactly legal. A ripple went through the crowd. Karen's fingers tightened around her clipboard. That's a baseless accusation. I smirked. Then you won't mind if I read off a few interesting notes from this ledger. I tapped my screen. According to this, over the past 2 years, the HOA has issued more than $50,000 in fines. Now that wouldn't be an issue, except there's no record of where that money went. The murmur in the crowd grew louder. Some people looked at each other in disbelief. Others, like Frank, nodded knowingly. They had suspected this for a long time. Karen's face turned a blotchy shade of red. That information is confidential. I tilted my head. See, that's the thing. HOA funds are supposed to be publicly accessible to homeowners. But when I asked for financial records, I was told they didn't exist. Almost like someone was keeping them off the books. George, the nervous board member, suddenly found the courage to speak up. Karen, is that true? I mean, we never really saw any reports. Karen turned to him sharply. Of course it's true. The board approved everything. George swallowed hard. I don't remember approving $50,000 worth of fines. The crowd's murmurs turned into outright talking. Some people started checking their phones, likely searching for their own past fines. I could see the panic creeping into Karen's expression, the way her carefully crafted world was slipping through her fingers. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You're twisting facts to make me look bad. I chuckled. I don't need to twist anything. The facts speak for themselves. I turned to the room. How many of you have been fined by Karen in the past year for something completely ridiculous? Hands shot up all over the room. People started calling out their experiences. Being fined for the color of their flower pots. For their kids drawing chalk on the sidewalk. For leaving their car in their own driveway for too long. Each new example only fueled the outrage growing in the room. Karen shot up from her seat, slamming her clipboard onto the table. Enough. This is my community and I have done nothing but keep it safe and orderly. You all should be thanking me. Someone in the back shouted, we should be suing you. Karen's expression twisted into something ugly. You ungrateful, pathetic little. Before she could finish, the doors to the community center opened. 2 uniformed police officers walked in. And this time they weren't here to humor her. Daniel stepped forward, nodding at me. Evening, folks. Sorry to interrupt, but we have some official business to take care of. He turned his gaze to Karen, whose face had drained of all color. Karen Wilkins, we need to have a conversation about financial fraud, impersonation of a law enforcement officer, and several counts of extortion. Karen let out a strangled laugh as if this were all some big joke. You can't be serious. Daniels pulled out a small stack of papers. You recognize these? Bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals from the HOA account? Pretty interesting reading material. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish. That's not, someone must have fabricated those. Daniels sighed. That's funny because we already confirmed with the bank. He motioned to his partner who stepped forward with handcuffs. Karen Wilkins, you're under arrest. The room erupted. Some people cheered. Others just stared in shock. Karen, meanwhile, looked like she had just been hit by a freight train. You can't arrest me. I am the HOA president. Daniels smiled. Yeah, and now you're also a suspect in a felony case. She started to fight as they cuffed her, shouting threats, promises of lawsuits, screaming about conspiracies. But nobody cared. The moment she was dragged out of the room, the atmosphere changed completely. People looked at each other, realization dawning. The reign of HOA Karen was over. I sat back down, grinning as I watched the chaos settle. Someone clapped me on the back. Damn, Carter. You really took her down. I shrugged. She did it to herself. I just made sure everyone saw. The meeting quickly turned into something else entirely. Neighbors laughing, talking about fixing the HOA, making sure no one like Karen could ever hold that much power again. There was something satisfying about it, seeing people take their community back. And just when I thought the night couldn't get any funnier, George hesitantly raised a hand. So, do we need to elect a new HOA president? The room went dead silent. Then someone groaned. Oh God. What if Karen's husband runs? I laughed, shaking my head. Well, if he does, at least we know how to handle it. For the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt lighter. And for the first time since I had moved in, I actually believed I might enjoy living. What was your favorite moment in the story? Did any scene make you laugh out loud? How do you think Karen truly believed she could get away with impersonating law enforcement? Was it arrogance, ignorance, or something else? If you were in Jake's position, how would you have handled the situation differently? Would you have exposed Karen earlier or let her dig her own grave like he did? Have you ever encountered a real-life Karen in an HOA or a position of authority? How did you deal with it? What do you think happened to Karen after her arrest? Do you think she learned her lesson, or is she plotting her next power move from behind bars?